Gotta move back.
What's happening?
Down, my man.
I'm taking better than death Israel.
What comes to mind when you think of terrorists? Bombs? Airplane hijackings? Who do you think of? Do they have darker skin? Speak another language? Follow a certain religion? If you thought of Arabs or those practicing the Islamic faith, I'm here today to look at how your mind has arrived to that conclusion. From an identity shrouded in mysterious harems full of scantily clad belly dancers to terrorists with hateful religious manifestos, terribly racist imagery of Arabs in media has existed for a long time. To fully understand the representations we see today, or even a century ago, we must take a deep dive into Orientalism. Orientalism is the idea that those living in the Eastern Hemisphere have very different special cultures that are drastically different from superior West. The unofficial start of Orientalism is believed to be 1312 during a church council meeting in Vienna. The spread of Islam attracted Christian theologians who study Islam voyeuristically. Some even wrote book guides on how to debate Muslims. Islam was a direct threat to the West. It held enormous military and political successes across several lands. From Arab conquest in the 7th century to the Ottoman Empire, Islam proved a formidable opponent to Christianity. As a result, Christian theologians spread lies and hysteria about Islam and the Prophet Muhammad. They even went on to say that Muslims worship the unholy Trinity. Orientalism was weaponized as a political tool during Western domination. Their golden age had passed as the West finally came to power, meaning their backward, barbaric culture was in decline. The Arab world consists of 22 countries spanning across Asia and Africa. Napoleon's Egyptian invasion in 1798 marked the modern period for the Middle East. A pan-Middle Eastern North African identity was created when intellectuals, writers, journalists, lawyers, and political leaders cried for Arab equality and liberty from the Ottomans. World War I marked a historical moment. The Ottomans were defeated by the British and French. Unfortunately, more colonialism followed. As a result of Britain and France seizing the Middle East, a mandate, a document that gave European government control of MENA possessions, caused education, public health, and welfare to suffer. This also included the Balfour Declaration that made Palestinians refugees on their homeland. Britain and France became known as masters of the Middle East in the 1920s. They also got help from America to assess the natural resources of the area, oil. Famous anthropologist Arjun Appadurai wrote Disjuncture and Difference in the Global Cultural Economy in 1990. It introduces widely used theory of the 5 scapes of cultural flows around the world that influence each other. Mediascapes blur the lines between fact and fiction. It allows them to construct an imagined world in the viewer's mind. The prevailing stereotypes of Arabs as backward, uncivilized, violent terrorists is enough to support that claim. Media and ideoscapes can be used to justify colonization. Iraq was televised. News cycles showed bombings, destruction, and never spoke of the trauma of those people they purposely referred to as insurgents. 9/11 caused a peculiar shift in media. While racist Middle Eastern and Muslim portrayals did still occupy most representation, there was a conscious increase in sympathetic portrayals on television. If a terrorist was present, positive representation was usually added to the story to balance it out. It could detail anything from airline discrimination, workplace discrimination, or blatant hate crimes. During the Bush administration, he made a point to distinguish between Arab friends and enemies. On the flip side, legislation in the form of the Patriot Act was passed to target Arabs and legalize suspension of their rights. Bush claimed the war in Iraq and Afghanistan came as a result of Islamic extremists hating our, Americans, freedom. Overt war propaganda had been waning in effectiveness since World War II and the Cold War, so these new dog whistles were used to amp up patriotism. The Patriot Act led to hyper-surveillance of Arab communities. Positing itself as a way to deter and punish terrorist acts, many didn't think much of it. Hyper-surveillance became a trend in much of the Arab representation, which is why there is such a focus on airline discrimination. Unfortunately, positive television representation only formed a new kind of racism. Acts of anti-racism and multiculturalism were superficially used to eschew discrimination, but ended up legitimizing racism anyway. Coming into the post-race era of the early 2000s, positive representation of Arabs was showing them as patriotic Americans who helped the U.S. to fight or as victims of hate crimes. Other representations involve flipping the enemy, a phenomenon in which audiences were led into believing that Muslims are terrorists, but then we found out it's a front for European terrorists. A popular stereotype of the oppressed Muslim woman is used by liberals and conservative media alike. In the aftermath of 9/11, many stories of Muslim and former Muslim women came out to shed light on the brutality of Islam. They detailed honor killings, female genital mutilation, dress code violation punishments, etc. Although it's a reality many Muslim women face, these stories were used to amp up anti-Muslim sentiment and anti-Arab racism. Moreover, even with the media's blatant shift in former stereotypes of Arabs, it ultimately failed to better the representation given because most of it justified discrimination anyway. A crucial factor in better representations for Arabs would be the inclusion of more roles that humanize them. Most media focusing on them tends to look at them as adults, already fully engulfed in radical extremist Islamic beliefs. Rarely do we hear about how these beliefs affect people within those terrorist countries. The 2017 film The Breadwinner changes that. The Breadwinner follows the story of a young Afghan girl, Parvana, living with her family under Taliban rule. While Americans and other Western countries may report of the imminent but distant danger of possible terrorism, Parvana experiences it daily, up close. The film addresses nuances that Western media cannot. While not shying away from the stereotypes of Arabs as terrorists and misogynists, it includes the indoctrination/grooming of young boys into this organization. Poverty and a sense of hopelessness are running themes throughout the film. After Parvana's father is arrested and thrown into jail, her family is left to fend for themselves. Taliban rule enforces all women to be accompanied by a man when going out. To keep her family from starving, Parvana cuts her hair and passes as a boy to buy food and earn money. Through the eyes of a naive child as she comes to terms with war, her father's possible death, misogyny, domestic violence, and the process of grief, The Breadwinner is a gem for its commitment to humanizing Arabs on screen. While still focusing on Arab children, I like to point in the direction of the 2018 sleeper hit Capernaum, a Lebanese film following Zan el-Hajj, a 12-year-old boy suing his parents for birthing him into a life of hardship. The story is told in flashbacks. Before being in prison, Zane doesn't go to school. Instead, he works seedy jobs selling drugs to help feed his younger siblings. Things become complicated when his 11-year-old sister Sahar gets her first period. Capernaum touches on poverty and how it lends a hand in misogyny and gender-based violence. Because his parents are poor, they sell Sahar off to their landlord Assad, where we learn that she is later raped and killed as a result of her body not being able to handle sexual acts. Immigration and race under Muslim identity are also themes explored. The Ethiopian baby Jonas and Zayn end up traveling Beirut together as a result of Jonas's mother, Rahil, having forged documents. Capernaum is a gentle, understanding depiction of Arabs that brings awareness to lesser-known Arab issues without the attached racism that usually follows in Western news reporting. The 2001 film Inch'Allah Dimanche is a French-Algerian period piece detailing the family reunification period in France. It was a law passed by the former French president Jacques Chirac that allowed Algerian men to move their families to France with them. While I feel that the movie does fall into familiar tropes of white saviorism and Arab men being violently misogynistic and patriarchal, it is important to take into consideration that a Nigerian woman, Yamina Benguigui, did make this film based largely on her own family experience. Inch'Allah Dimanche captures the loneliness of immigration. Zouina, the main character, is brought to France on a boat still mourning, leaving her own family behind as her mother-in-law chides her and hits her. Aside from the children, she is all alone. Her husband is at work all day, her children go to school, her mother-in-law is abusive, and she is not allowed to leave her home outside of grocery shopping. Even with all the problems with the film, it is inspiring to see how Zouina and other women like her persevered during this time period. For my final film recommendation, I like to include the 2006 documentary film Real Bad Arabs. It's an informative, comprehensive film detailing Hollywood's long-standing issue with Arab representation. From the sheiks of the 1920s to the ambiguous terrorists of today, Real Bad Arabs provides a detailed context to a century of Arab stereotypes on screen. The film includes everyone from Arab comedians to media analysts to give a deeper understanding of the harm that on-screen depictions have caused. Overall, Arab representation has come a long way and continues to get better. With more minority groups taking representation of themselves in their own hands via platforms like YouTube, Arabs have a space of their own to map out their complex identities. There have also been a multitude of calls for diversity in entertainment media for years that allow more Arab creatives to get their ideas out via streaming services like Netflix, Hulu, Amazon Prime, etc. While mainstream Hollywood may not be ready for multi-dimensional Arab characters, others may be more ready and willing.